Rustwood was little more than a faded dot on the desert map, a handful of sun-bleached buildings clinging to the edge of the Sierra Plains. People passed through. Almost no one stayed. Elias Brand was the exception. For 5 years, he had lived quietly in a small room behind the town's blacksmith shop, spending his days hammering iron and steel, then disappearing into silence each night. Elias was a man of few words, nearly a recluse. His solid build, old scars, and distant gaze led many to assume he had once been a soldier or someone long acquainted with violence. He never confirmed it, and he never denied it. The only thing he offered Rustwood was his exceptional skill as a blacksmith. From horseshoes and wagon wheels to door hinges, anything that passed through his hands came out sturdier than most. People didn't understand him, but they trusted him. Beyond the forge, Elias kept his distance from everyone. He joined no conversations, shared nothing of his past, and never explained why he had chosen a dying town as a place to stop. In time, Rustwood grew accustomed to his quiet presence, a man like a shadow, necessary yet unreachable. No one knew what Elias was running from. Only the steady rhythm of his hammer, echoing day after day, hinted that beneath the silence lay a past that had never truly gone to sleep. By late summer, the wind over the Sierra Plains shifted, carrying air that felt dry and oppressive. Sheriff Ellis Wade stopped by the forge on a sweltering afternoon, his voice dropping as he delivered grim news. A brutal gang had just robbed a money wagon in Dry Hollow, leaving no survivors, and they were moving toward Rustwood. They didn't need a reason. They only needed a town to spread fear. Elias kept working the iron. The red-hot steel plunged into the oil barrel with a sharp hiss. He glanced at the sheriff with pale blue eyes and said calmly that Rustwood had no money worth stealing. But Wade knew better than anyone men like that didn't come for money, but for the message they left behind. Help from Broken Bluff had been requested, but it would take 3 days to arrive. If the gang came sooner, Rustwood would be completely alone. Elias said nothing more. He only brought the hammer down harder, each blow sounding like something being driven deep into his chest. That evening, the townspeople gathered at Miss Laurel's cafe. Anxious whispers filled the small room. When someone suggested asking Elias for help, he claimed he was only a blacksmith. Then he was the one who broke the silence with a cold remark. A predator never passes up a weak prey. In that moment, everyone understood the danger was already close. The riders appeared the very next afternoon, no warning bells, no shouted threats, just a cloud of dust rising at the far end of Main Street and 4 figures cutting through the sunlight like an ill omen. Sheriff Wade and his deputy, Ben, stepped out to block the road, guns in hand, their fingers trembling. They never got the chance to pull the trigger. The shots rang out first. Both men fell in the middle of the street. The 2 remaining riders wheeled their horses and fled, leaving Rustwood stunned and soaked in blood. From the shadows of the forge, Elias saw everything. He didn't rush out. He didn't run away. His face was tight, his expression calm to the point of cold, like a man weighing the cost of a decision postponed for far too long. He knew this bloodshed wasn't over. The men would return, in greater numbers and with greater cruelty. Night fell, and fear gripped the town. The wounded were bandaged, windows were shuttered, and every breath felt heavy. When Miss Laurel asked what they should do next, every gaze turned almost unconsciously toward Elias. This time, he didn't look away. Elias looked over the faces that had always treated him as an outsider. His voice was low and final. They would not beg, and they would not run. If the gang came back, Rustwood would make them pay. And for the first time in 5 years, Elias walked toward the forge not as a blacksmith, but as a man who had chosen to face his past head-on. After deciding to stand up for Rustwood, Elias returned to the forge once night had fully settled over the town. The fire burned hotter than usual, casting his shadow long and twisted across the smoke-stained walls. He stepped into the small room behind the forge, a place no one in Rustwood had ever been allowed to enter. He opened an old wooden chest, its metal fittings darkened by age. Inside, carefully wrapped in faded burlap, lay 2 revolvers and a chipped badge, objects that had no place in the life of a blacksmith. Elias lifted them, his hands unnervingly steady, as if the memories had never truly left him. Before the stunned eyes of Deputy Ben, Elias admitted the truth. He had once ridden with men like the bandits out there, He had worn a badge, had believed that justice could be enforced at gunpoint. That past was no source of pride, it was a burden he had buried beneath steel and sweat for 5 long years. But tonight, the old fire would no longer be held back. Not in search of glory, and not to atone through blood, but to keep Rustwood from becoming the next pile of ashes. Elias understood clearly. What was awakening in him was not the man he used to be, but what remained of him sharp enough to protect what he refused to lose ever again. Before dawn broke, Elias's forge had become the center of the entire town. The fire burned through the night, the hammer never falling silent, no longer shaping horseshoes or door hinges, but iron bars for reinforcements, traps, and barricades. Elias worked without rest, as if every strike was forging Rustwood's fate itself. He showed Deputy Ben how to set traps outside the saloon, reinforce the church windows, and scatter strips of iron caltrops along Main Street. Crude, simple measures, but enough to turn an exposed town into a place that would not be easily swallowed. One by one, the townspeople came, afraid, hesitant, but with nowhere left to retreat. When everyone had gathered, Elias stood among them, no longer the quiet blacksmith. His voice was firm and clear. The bandits thought Rustwood was nothing but a flock of sheep, but sheep that fight back make wolves hesitate. Not everyone agreed. A few chose to leave in the night, taking their families and their fear with them. But enough stayed. They learned how to hold their positions, how not to panic when shots rang out, how to trust the person standing beside them. Rustwood had never been a warrior town, but in that moment they understood survival didn't come from having more guns, but from standing their ground together, with no one turning their back to run anymore. Morning arrived slowly and heavily, fog blanketing the barren land around Rustwood as if the entire prairie were holding its breath. The rough barricades raised overnight turned Main Street into a silent front line. Elias stood at the edge of town, his coat fluttering faintly in the cold wind, eyes fixed on the horizon. From within the mist, shapes began to emerge. Not 4 riders, but 9 clad in dark coats, guns half hidden beneath worn leather. Their leader rode a pale horse, his cold gaze sweeping over the town as if its fate had already been decided. Elias stepped forward alone, unarmed, his voice low and steady. He neither begged nor provoked. It was a final warning. The moment Elias stepped back behind the barricades, the church bell rang, tearing through the air. Traps detonated. Dirt and smoke exploded upward as gunfire thundered from rooftops and windows. Rustwood was silent no longer. The town had chosen to rise. If you want to know how brutal that battle became, who paid the price, and whether Rustwood survived the choice it made, keep following the story, leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The confrontation has only just begun. The firefight quickly turned Main Street into chaos. Gunshots ricocheted off wooden walls, horses screamed in panic, and dust and gun smoke choked the air. Elias moved calmly through the storm of bullets, each shot short and precise, no rage behind them, only the resolve to end the threat devouring the town. In the midst of the chaos, Elias noticed the leader breaking away from the group, circling through the stables to launch a flanking attack. He left his position, slipping through the narrow alleys behind the shops, his steps light and deliberate. When they faced each other inside the hay-filled stable, there was no space left for words. 2 shots rang out and both missed. Then came the collision of bodies, fists, knees, and ragged breaths colliding in close quarters. It wasn't a clean or noble fight. There was only pain, sweat, and the surge of violent memories. Elias brought his opponent down not to prove anything, but to end it. When he dragged the leader back into the main street, the surviving bandits understood the message. They dropped their guns and fled. Rustwood held its ground. But Elias knew all too well that the price of victory wasn't measured only by those who had fallen. It was also the cost of having once again crossed a line he had sworn he would never return to. When the gunfire finally faded, Rustwood fell into a heavy silence. Smoke still hung over Main Street, blood soaked into the dry earth, and the survivors emerged from their hiding places, eyes not yet convinced they were still breathing. Elias stood in the middle of town, his coat torn, his hands smeared with blood, his face marked more by exhaustion than by victory. Under the stares that mixed fear with gratitude, Elias knew he could no longer remain silent. He stepped onto the wooden stoop outside the saloon and spoke the truth he had buried for years. Elias Brand was only a name he had chosen to run from himself. The man he used to be carried a different name, a man of the law, who once wore a badge, who once believed justice could be forged through violence. He told them about firing too quickly, about people who never got the chance to go on living, and about the moment he realized the badge wasn't heavy enough to keep him from guilt. So he walked away, changed his name, chose a hammer over a gun, and silence over command. No one spoke to condemn him. Miss Laurel was the first to step forward, reminding everyone that Elias was the man who had built the church doors, repaired their weapons, and given Rustwood 5 years of peace. The silence shifted from suspicion to understanding. In that moment, Elias was no longer the past he feared, but the man he had become. 2 days after the battle, while Rustwood was still stitching its wounds, a stranger rode into town. Marshal Avery Lane, a federal representative, had come to investigate. News of 9 dead men and a captured gang leader couldn't be hidden. Elias knew it well. The past he had tried to bury had finally caught up with him. Inside the saloon, before the entire town, Lane called Elias by the old name he had left behind. He spoke of the badge, of the unexplained disappearance, of a law that had never officially absolved him. Elias offered no defense. He simply said he had stopped running, and that he was protecting this place now not in the name of the law, but in the name of the people standing around him. Lane turned to the townsfolk and asked if anyone wished to accuse Elias. Not a single hand was raised. Miss Laurel, the doctor, Deputy Ben all stood with him. They didn't see a gunman. They saw the man who had helped them survive. In the end, Lane set something on the bar that Elias thought he would never see again, his old badge. But Elias refused it. He didn't need it to do the right thing anymore. The badge could stay here as a reminder that justice doesn't always come from a gun barrel or a title. Sometimes, it comes simply from choosing to stand with people. In the days that followed, Rustwood slowly returned to its old rhythm, unhurried, but steadier than before. Boards were taken down from the windows. Main Street was swept clean of blood and ash, and the laughter of children returned, hesitant at first, then clearer. The town had been wounded, but it had not broken. Elias went back to work at the forge, his hands more at home with hammer and steel than with guns. He didn't touch a firearm again after the battle. One evening, he left town carrying the old badge and walked to a windswept hillside. Beneath the roots of a dead tree, Elias buried it, as if laying to rest the part of his life he refused to return to. He didn't curse the past, and he didn't ask for forgiveness, he simply let it sleep. When Elias returned, a lamp was lit in the forge window. Miss Laurel had left the light burning as a sign someone was waiting for him, not out of duty, not because of a badge or spilled blood, but because he belonged here. Elias paused, looking over Rustwood in the quiet night. He understood then that he wasn't staying because he had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time in a long while, he had found a place that didn't require him to be anyone else. The past had forged him, but Rustwood was the place that finally gave him a home.